I've recently learned that some people from Newcastle said that they would never go past Hexham, they would never go further west than that. And that's really the relevance that Maitland had to them at that time. Of course, that was very short-sighted because Maitland was, in the 19th century, in effect, the capital of the Hunter Valley. This still has a resonance today. Just to give you one example of that, the Catholic Church established its first cathedral in Maitland, and that was in 1866. And until fairly recently, the diocese that was covering Newcastle was known as the Diocese of Maitland, and the bishop was the Bishop of Maitland. For many people, Maitland didn't become relevant again until 1955 because Newcastle had grown up and Maitland had kind of declined. And many of you will have knowledge of the Great Flood of 1955. And tonight we are lucky to have as our guest speaker Chaz Keys, who is a flood expert. Chaz was the Deputy Director of the State Emergency Services and has become an expert on floods in New South Wales, not just for Maitland. He has written a number of books on the subjects. I came across Chaz as a result of a University of the Third Age course on Maitland. Now, in my naivety, I thought it was just going to be one class. But as it turned out, it went for a whole term. This is, in fact, a testament to the knowledge that Chaz has accumulated about the history of the city of Maitland, and in particular, the flooding of Maitland. This evening, we are going to have the benefit of just a smidgen of his knowledge. I've also learned he's a cricket nut, but we're not going to go down that path, or he'd be here forever, I think. So it gives me a great pleasure to welcome Chaz to the Newcastle Family Historical Society's monthly talk series, and he will explore this question: is the Lower Hunter ready for a flood like that of 1955 or bigger?
Thank you, Bert. I posed a question there, and if we want to have a really early night, I could answer it in. Short version would be 3 words, the long version would be about 6. So I'm going to give you 3 talks: 3-word version, a 6-word version, and then version which will last rather longer. The 3-word version would be, I think, yes and no. But you might think that means I'm sitting on the fence. So I'll take it a little bit further and say the longer version is yes and no, but mostly no. That's a 6-word version. So that's 2 talks done. Let's talk about 55 just to set the scene for how bad it was, which would allow me to put some flesh on the bones of the question that I posed. It was the worst flood that the Hunter has ever seen pretty well throughout. There's one exception, the Wollombi, which is one of the tributaries on the comes from the southern side, high in the valley, Bulga, Warkworth, those sorts of places. Pretty well everywhere else in the valley had the worst flood in European history, which is a couple hundred years. Maitland was settled in 1818, Newcastle, I think 1801, further up the valley a little later than 1818. And most of the towns are on the river or one of its tributaries. And they had all experienced by 55 lots of floods, and all of a sudden we had a flood that was way worse than anything any of them had ever seen, from Very War, Cassilis, however it's pronounced, Murrurundi, all the way down through Scone, Aberdeen, Muswellbrook, Denman, Singleton, Maitland, Raymond Terrace, Hexham, Newcastle, and a few like Dundalk tributaries. Most of them had their worst flood in 1955. And in fact, in most places, it wasn't just the worst, it was comfortably the worst. And I'm going to come back to that point about how in some areas the worst flood is way worse than the next worst flood. In some areas, there's a whole bunch of floods more or less the same. So the flooded record is actually several floods. In the case of the Hunter, through most of us, at least 55, is way worse than anything else. That's certainly true at Maitland, most of which this talk will be about. There were, in 1955, let me put up a few characteristics. Worst flood in Maitland, most of the valley. The second worst, which is in different locations for different floods, is in most places nowhere near as bad. 14 deaths, 11 of them in the Maitland area, 3 somewhere near Singleton, outside Singleton, Maitland around there, I think. Massive damage to all sorts of things. Lots of houses, more than 100 houses either destroyed by the flood or so badly damaged, so badly damaged that they had to be demolished later. Lots of businesses flooded, lots of some of them never recovered, some of them never reappeared. Huge damage on the farms, as is always the case. Farmers are always low down on the floodplain because floodplain is very fertile and attractive to farming pursuits, whether it's livestock or crops. Lots of infrastructure damage. The railway line, which goes up through the valley, was washed away in lots of places, and the same is true of the roads. So massive damage, pretty well throughout the valley, and certainly in Maitland. Newcastle had a major steelworks at the time, of course, the BHP, Mayfield West. That was invaded by floodwater, did a lot of damage to production, did a lot of damage to plant, and not just the steelworks, but all the linked industries like the Newcastle Chemical Company, which was big news at the time, and all the industries that either bought things from the BHP for fabrication into manufactured items, or provided the BHP with things it needed, like lysates, for example. They were all badly affected. Yet the impacts in Newcastle on the residential sector were nowhere near as bad as in Maitland. Places like Birmingham Gardens were flooded, not much settled at the time, but plenty of places in Birmingham Gardens now, houses would be affected in a flood of similar size, and obviously worse in a bigger flood. Carrington was flooded, not much in central Newcastle itself. By then you're into the sea, basically, but a fair bit of impact in the Newcastle area generally. A very long and difficult recovery. It took years. Lots of things were affected. Social life was affected. Sporting life was affected. Rugby and rugby league were not much played in the 55 winter. The thing happened in February, late February, and it took months for normal life to return. And for some individuals, took ages to recover, and some never did. I've often thought that the time to have a disaster like this that affects your house is not close to the end of your career. You don't have time to recover. And of course, a lot of people were in that situation. So a very difficult recovery. The place was economically, socially, psychologically affected. That last statement's true, but only partially true, I think. The 55 flood was not just a Hunter Valley thing. There was lots of flooding from the same weather event on the Darling inland. So I'm talking about Moree on the Gwydir. I'm talking about Tamworth, the Gunnedah, Narrabri on the Namoy. I'm talking about Coonabarabran, Coonamble, Gilgandra on the Castlereagh, Dubbo, Wellington, Narromine on the Macquarie, Nyngan on the Bogan. So all of those areas had their record floods at the same time. And there had been in previous years a lot of floods in New South Wales. I think between about 1949, when Kempsey was badly affected on the River as well, Macleay. Between 49 and 56, every river in New South Wales had a really bad flood, and which means that most areas of New South Wales had been very badly affected by flooding in that period. It's the most flood-rich period in the history of New South Wales, i.e. since Europe settled. And that kind of broke the back of the government's thinking in terms of managing floods. There were a lot of problems, and all of those things forced the government in the mid-50s to say, well, we need to do something about this. We're copying these problems all the time. We're struggling with them. We need to do things. And that led to a lot of flood mitigation, a big program of flood mitigation led by the Department of Public Works and the Department of Water Resources. Two departments got involved. The State Emergency Service was formed as a so-called combat agency, formed to lead communities through flood events. That means in terms of flood warning, in terms of rescue, in terms of evacuation, and to some extent terms of recovery, but a whole lot of other agencies became involved. And one of the things that we've done then, apart from flood mitigation, building levees and other physical devices, there was an emergency management structure was built up, which knitted all of the agencies together in managing the event. And the SES had the job of floods. The Rural Fire Service, now called the Bushfire Brigades, it was then called, had the job of bushfires. Later on, the SES also stored the management of damage from thunderstorms, wind and hail damage, for example. If there was to be an outbreak of an exotic animal disease on the farm, the Department of Agriculture will be a combat agency, and all of the other agencies pitch in with their expertise. So it's an emergency management system was built, whereas until the 50s, basically it was just cobbled together. Councils, for example, had a big role, they still do it, but they don't normally have the lead role anymore. So that's the 55 flood in the Hunter and in the Broad where it went. This is a picture. Those of you who have been Western Maitland and Exxon will recognise that as the Belmore Bridge, which links Central Maitland with Lorne, which is on the northern side. There's the river at low flow, and those poles sticking out of the ground are the gauge, the local flood gauge. Now, you probably can't read the gradations. You can see there are markings on them. The top of that top element, the steel pipe, basically, is about 12 metres. That is to say, 12.1 actually, metres above mean sea level. Mean sea level is halfway between high and low tides. The river at that point, which is not in flood, is probably at about 1 metre, and it's tidal. It's tidal to a few hundred metres above this point. In 55, the top element of that gauge, you can see it's a bunch of steel poles that march up the bank, and I'm standing on the top of the bank, which is actually the levee, when I took that photo. So it's at 1 metre at that point, and the top of the top gauge is 12.1 metres. That's what we got to in 55. I think I've got a picture of a recent flood here. That happens to be the last flood in Maitland. That's a hydrograph showing how high the water got at that gauge. And this is a relatively piddling flood, which happened a couple of months ago, early August. And this is the hydrograph trace. So that shows you that it's tidal, up and down. It's only about half to 3/4 of a metre difference between low and high tide. So near the top of the tidal influence. Tidal influence is greater at Morpeth, greater again at Raymond Terrace, Hexham, down to Newcastle. And it rose, whatever the date of that is, early August the 2nd. There's the rise, and it got up to 8-point-something metres. And you can see there's really two little peaks, and then it fell away. So that's not a significant flood. It's only a minor flood. This line here at 5.9 metres is the locally determined minor flood level. Basically, all it means is that in the reference area of the gauge, the area around the gauge, there's a bit of nuisance to be put up with, which will mean things like farmlands flooded, minor roads cut, etc. It's not going to be very life-threatening. And in that case, the flood only got to sort of high minor. There's a moderate flood, and then there's a major flood level, which is 10.5 metres at the gauge. And that's that basically means lots of evacuations are likely to be, or significant numbers of people are going to have to leave their homes. So that is a picture of an actual flood in terms of its rise and fall at the gauge. All right, so we've talked about the flood of 55, which reached, let's say, 12.1 metres on the Belmore gauge. And worse than that is possible. Now, that's the worst flood in European history, 200 years. Well, there was a really bad one in 1820. Maitland had only just been set at the time. We don't know much about it. Probably about the same as 55. The closer to today become, the more reliable the records are. Until about 1850, the records of floods were pretty messy. Some floods were missed. After 1850, they're pretty good. And we know increasingly a lot about them in recent times. But the point I want to make here is that however bad 55 was, and it's very bad, it's not just possible, but I would say inevitable that there will be worse. And that first statement, the worst we've seen is never the worst possible, is important because people tend not to believe it. People of a certain age, like us, who have been here a long time, and I think come to believe we're the keepers of the community record, tend to think that they've seen it all. Well, they've seen all that was available then for them to see. But no one has ever seen it all. There's a famous story of a bloke in Singleton, an elderly gent, who got a bit cranky when people in Singleton started lifting their gear and sitting on trucks to take it to high ground, Singleton Heights or wherever. And he said, look, this is ridiculous. He said, I saw 1893, nothing would be as bad as that. Well, of course, it was worse. So that's my point about keepers of the record. I think that means we're a bit defensive of the record. I saw really bad, you haven't, young chap. So listen to me, you don't know what you're talking about. Well, it's a dangerous place to go. And there's also lots of geological evidence of worse floods than we know of. When I say know of, through in European times. There is geological evidence. That happens to be a little piece of High Street in Maitland, the dark area, not that clear, is the so-called dry triangle or dry area, which wasn't affected in 1955. And the reason we know that is that that's alluvial soils. The natural soils there were alluvial, meaning laid down by a river in flood. And if it wasn't flooded in 55, they must have been laid down in an older flood, lost in the mists of time, which hasn't been dated. So I have no idea how old, but that is an area which has been flooded, but wasn't flooded in 55. So it was obviously a bigger flood than 1955. And several rivers in New South Wales have documented cases. The Hawkesbury is one, the Brisbane is one, not in New South Wales, used to be a long time ago. But both of those rivers have known areas with alluvial soils that were not inundated in their worst floods. So that makes the point there have been worse floods than 55 or worse floods than anywhere. I mentioned the Lismore example. Lismore was a really great flood in 2022, 3.5 years ago. The worst, now, if you had lived in Lismore in 2025, let's say you were 100 years old and you'd been there the whole time, and you thought you'd seen the worst, you had seen 1954 and 1974, both of which got to about 12.2 metres on their local gauge. And if you thought you'd seen everything, you were about, like the Singleton man in 55, to be proved horribly wrong. Because in 2022, and this has been in the news ever since, it's a huge recovery issue. They brought back 500 houses there for demolition or removal. But that flood in 22 got to 14.4. So it was 2.2 metres higher than the previous worst flood recorded in 100 years, 150 years, in fact, of Lismore's history to that point. So you ain't seen nothing yet, is the message. You've never seen what nature could produce. There's a thing called a PMF, probable maximum flood, which hydrologists work out. It's an estimate, which means it's probably not necessarily all that accurate, but it's an indication of how high a flood might get to. In Maitland's case, that's over 14 metres, as against 12.1 in 55. In Lismore's case, it's 16 metres, as against the 14.4 it got to 3 years ago. There's a really interesting case in Windsor. Now, Windsor had a really bad flood in 1867, so no one now alive remembers it or saw it. That flood got to 19.3 on the Windsor gauge on Hawkesbury River. The PMF there is something like 27 metres. It's an extra, what is it, 8 metres. Now that's because the Hawkesbury River starts in hills, flows across the floodplain, then goes in hills again. And it winds its way through those hills and eventually out to sea. And in winding, it winds through a very narrow valley, which is a choke. In other words, the water can't get away because it's unlike Hunter, where the floodplains are in the lower part of the river, the floodplains are in the middle part of the river, and then it flows into areas with no floodplains. So you get this situation with all these tributaries feeding floodwater in, and it can't get out. It's the water is choked off by this narrow valley downstream of Windsor. So as the dirt goes up to an incredible height. So I'm belaboring the point a bit, but I think you'll get what I'm saying. Was whatever you've seen, there will be worse one day. You probably won't see it if you people of our ages. I mean, the next bad flood on the Hawks on the Hunter could be next week, and it could be in 500 years. We will probably see next week. Probably won't happen next week, and certainly won't see 500 years from that. But there is geological evidence which needs to be taken note of. Estimates of future potential. Well, we sort of talked about that a bit, but let's have a look at. This is a series of maps showing the inundation of central Maitland in relatively rare floods. They're estimates, probably not precisely accurate, doesn't matter, they are indicative, and they give a pretty good picture. For those of you who have been with the Hexham, this is Maitland, this is Lorne, and this is the river coming through here, and this is East Maitland over here. Now, that is the 2% flood, which is a flood that occurs on average, and that's an important qualification, about every 50 years. So when you hear the term 50-year flood or 100-year flood, everyone's called the term 100-year flood. It doesn't mean it happens every 100 years. It means it happens on average every 100 years, which might mean it happens in this year and then next, and then not again for 500 years. I mean, flooding is not an even thing in time. It's not nature's way. So this is the flood that has, which is big enough that it has a 2% chance of occurring in any given year. And that translates to once every 50 years. Now that flood, I said before 12.1 was the 55 flood. That's about 11.4 meters. That hasn't happened since 55. There was one about 11.1 in, I think, in 1971. Not too different from that. The next one shows the 100-year flood. That's the 1% flood. There's a 1% chance of occurring every year. 55 is actually bigger than that. If you can remember the previous one, Central Maitland is still there, but it's a bit shrunken. Lorne is still there. Everything else is much the same. Then if we go to, that's a 200-year flood. That has a 0.5% chance of occurring every year. Now you can see now Central Maitland has shrunk. Lorne is beginning to get invaded. It's got a levee, but the levee only goes around 3 sides of Lorne. There is a low side, and there's good reasons for that. But the water comes in as backwater flow. So it's going around and coming in from the back. No velocity, not particularly dangerous, still going to invade people's houses. And in this case, it's come across from the downstream side, and it's going in that way. Now this one's a bit arresting. This is the 500-year flood. So there's no Central Maitland left, and there's no Lorne. The levees have been overtopped, or the water has got in through the areas that aren't levied, and there's no ground left. And not so important, but the Rutherford Talara side, top left-hand corner, and the East Maitland side are sort of slightly eroded as well. So there, the community is completely inundated. There is no dry ground left. People have got to have got out before it gets to that, and that's the responsibility of the SES. And I'm glad I don't have to put up with it anymore, because there's no question that would be a difficult responsibility to manage. Whoever's got the job of being the boss of the SES at that time will lose his or her job, I'm pretty certain. That's just the way it is. Okay, so where are we in terms of readiness? Well, I think you can say there are positives and there are negatives here. This one here on the left with the heading for this is flood mitigation. That one on the left is the mitigation system in terms of levees as it was in 1953. So basically, that's what the 55 flood meant. And you can see there's levees on each side of the river that was in between them. On this side here, this is Central Maitland. This is here, that's Lorne, that's East Maitland. This one here was built largely by the Bulwarra Embankment Committee, which was basically the farmers of Bulwarra. There were something like 50 farmers, probably 3 now, through farm enlargement. And they built that levee progressively from about the 1860s until the 1950s. And they did it. It's purely voluntary. It wasn't controlled by anyone. Wasn't licensed by council. And it wasn't necessarily a particularly good levy. I mean, farmers are good at farming. That doesn't make them good at flood mitigation. Wouldn't have any qualifications for it. It's just a dirt bank piled up. It was built in 5 sections, each of which was under the leadership of a particular farmer, but they built it to different standards, which means that there were low points. It wasn't a nice even grade. Now, if you've got low points, what's the river going to attack? It's going to attack the low points, and you're going to get erosion. If you have an even grade, you'll get the water over all of it. There'll be less damage, there'll be some damage all the way, but not colossal damage. So it wasn't properly built. I'm not going to go into principles of this, but you've got to have a steady gradient. You've got to have batters, riverside and on the other side. You don't want it too close to the river, particularly if there's a levy on the other side, as there is here, built by the Hampton Embankment Committee and by the Borough Council from the 1850s. And you can see that if it's if the levees are too close in, it will hem the river in. What will that mean? It'll go up, come a flood. So you need to give the river some room to grow its flood. You know, the difficulty for the farmers was that means you're losing some land. So they wanted to maximise the use of their land. So they built the levees basically on the top of the banks. Not a good idea. Now, on the other side, of course, you've got High Street, which comes up here, very close to the river. Shops on both sides, but you don't have much of a choice about the levy there, unless you're going to get rid of the shops, and you're not. So on both sides, it was built too close. It wasn't built to proper engineering standards, and those levies used to get overtopped and breached quite frequently. They kept out the little floods, the minor floods, which is a benefit, but they were always found out by the bigger one. And come 55, when the state government said, well, we've had enough of this, we'll build some proper levies. Those levies were then either got rid of or augmented by public works. There was a flood mitigation scheme devised, and that's on the right-hand side. You won't be able to read the writings up, but put it on its side so that the north is at the top, which it wasn't in the original. Now, you can't really tell there, but the banks are, in most cases, the embankments are a little bit further away from the river, probably not far enough. I'm not saying they would work perfectly. There is a levy on both sides again. Part of it is continuous with the old Walwara Embankment Committee levy, but improved. And then there's another levy here on around South Bay, here and here, which is built to keep water. Water has come up the tributary Wallace Creek, up the tributary Wallace Creek from the Hunter, or down Wallace Creek, and tapping made them from the Stack. So it's a bit complicated. I'm not going to go into the details more than to say that. But there's no question it's a better system now than the system that was there in 55, which is not perfect, and it gets damaged in floods. There were 3 or 4 floods in 2022, which did a small number of millions of dollars worth of damage in terms of repair, washing rock of wetland away, eroding the banks, etc. And some of that was only just been completed 3 years later. And that's to be expected. So, and in any case, this modern levy is not built to keep out all floods. And I'll come back to that shortly. Again, it keeps out minor floods, moderate floods, and what you might call lower major floods, but it's not designed to keep out the PMF, the worst possible flood that could occur, which is probably 1.5 meters higher than the levies. Anyway, flood warning. Now we've had flood warning of a sort in the Hunter since the beginning of the telegraph, which was in the 1850s. The key gauge, as far as Maitland's concerned, is Singleton, which is roughly a day's travel time of a flood up the Gulf Maitland. So there was a bridge there, the Denali Bridge. It's even further west of Hexham, so you might not have seen it. There's a bridge there with a gauge next to it. And over time, and with the use of the telegraph system to pass the message down and put on billboards outside the Mercury office, Maitland Mercury, outside the post office in Central Maitland. People would go and look at it, and there would be an estimate there, even in the 19th century, of how bad this flood was going to be, what it might get to in Maitland based on what it was at Singleton. Later, more and more gauges were put in. A system of gauge readers, people, most often postmasters or postmistresses, would go out in the dead of night, so not quite numbers, and report via the telephone, so long as you had the telephone, it goes down, would report what the flood was in their location. If you were the Patterson or the Williams or the Upper Hunter or the Goulburn or whatever, the Wollongong. So people in Maitland, like a warning system centred on the council, which would estimate how bad it was going to be. So there were warning systems. But nowadays, of course, they're much better. We've got many more gauges than we used to have. They're telemetered, which is to say you don't have to have people going out and not risking their lives to look at a gauge. It goes electronically to a desk, if you like, in the Bureau of Meteorology in Sydney, which makes calculations and says, okay, it's got to whatever it is at Singleton. It will get to 10.3 metres at midnight tonight in Maitland. So you've got a height measure and a time measure based on all the upstream gauge readings that you've collected. And that's the modern system, and that exists on pretty well every river in New South Wales. It works pretty well. It's an estimate. It's not always accurate. I've known the Bureau to be half a metre out at times, and I don't think that's much of a problem, but some people think it's a terrible problem. If people want accuracy, well, science can't give you that all the time. Science and management, it gives you estimates, which will be a guide and maybe not perfectly right. Flood management, I sort of mentioned this before, the advent of the SES, the development of an emergency management system with agencies with their responsibilities. So you've got DOCS, or whatever it's called this week, Department of Community Services, which looks after evacuees, usually in high school gymnasia or assembly halls or whatever. We don't have special purpose-built evacuation centres. The SES coordinates the door knocks to advise people to leave, etc., etc., etc. Provides updates over the radio and television stations and all of that. So there's a whole management system involving many agencies, in the case of floods, under the leadership, I guess you could say, of the SES team game. Demographic change. We're looking here at the way things have been improved by way of creating response capabilities, by way of developing mitigation, by way of growing warning systems, etc. Demographic change is an important positive. The population of Central Maitland, by which I mean, for those of you who know it, between Wallace Creek and the Long Bridge, the population of that area which includes Horseshoe Bend and South Maitland and the CBD, population was something like 5,400 in 1954, which was a census year. It's now something like 17. So only a third of the population. The population that here is a third of what it was. So that's an improvement, given all of that is floodprone. And all of it must have been inundated at some stage. There wasn't any dry island, it wasn't in 55, but you've got to say that in terms of potential, it's all floodprone. And there's fewer people in it. There are fewer farmers now than there used to be, and they're all on the floodplain. So that's a benefit in terms of the size of the job. The development of Maitland has taken place in East Maitland, which is a big hill, and in West Maitland, which is Rutherford, Tullara, and further away. And places like Gilliston Heights, a new suburb only in the last 30 years or so. So the demographic look and feel of the place has changed considerably since 55, and it's to the better. I think the population is now just late last year it passed 100,000. In a flood like 55, the number of people who would have to leave is probably of the order of 6,000 or 7,000. So call it 6 or 7% of the population would have to evacuate. Whereas in 55, a third of the population had to evacuate because there were many more of them were in Central Maitland, not on the hills on the other side. So there are lots of positives here where things aren't as bad as they might be, but there are negatives as well. Things where communities not better off in terms of its readiness for the next flood. There's one of them. There hasn't been a really bad flood since 1955. There's been floods. 71 was pretty bad, people had to evacuate. 07 was pretty bad, the Peshabolka storm. The flood is named after the Patrick Boggle. It has nothing to do with Patrick Boggle, but happened at the same time. There's been nothing like 55, and of course hardly anything was left 55. We just had the 70th anniversary of the 55 flood, so if we've had an adult experience of it, you'd have to be 90 in that. Well, bad news. Most people don't live to 90. So that experience has largely gone. The community is not as experienced in flood management as it used to be. What they knew has been eroded by the passage of time. There's a difficult flood psychology. I think we've been writing about this, that I'm not a psychologist. People don't want to think about bad floods. And I can understand that. I do want to think about them, but then I'm unusual. You don't want to be told even that you live in a flood-prone area. The messenger tends to get shot when he says that someone who is in a flood-prone area. So there was a map published showing the extent of a likely flood of a particular level. Has always held apart. People don't want to know. One of the things that's interesting about Nathan is that in 1982, Public Works put up a whole lot of markers on power poles, 1955 flood at the level that it reached. Well, that's 40 odd years ago. I did a census, and there was something close to 100 of them put up in and around central Melbourne. Council didn't like it, they weren't asked, and that would have annoyed them. I think Public Works probably said, well, if we ask council, they'll make it impossible, so we won't ask them to put them up in the red light. People don't like them. When they're about to sell their house, they don't particularly want a sign outside advertising its flood proneness, so they tend to steal them. Council doesn't replace them, and there's now fewer than 10 left of nearly 100. There's some in Exham, there are some in Raymond Terrace, there are some in various places. And they're nearly all gone. And the ones that are left are very high up, and you can't see them. They're rusty. So there was an initiative which is sort of flood mitigation in the way of educating people, which has been allowed to rust away or get stolen virtually, literally. So it's hard to keep people's minds on the potential for floods. Of course, they want to know when a flood's coming. And they'll want helping, but they don't want to know beforehand. They don't really want to prepare themselves. I mean, people are, and I can understand this, people are worried about the day to day. How am I going to job? Am I going to get the promotion? Why is little Johnny in trouble at school? Has the family had its COVID vaccine? Or whatever the concerns of the moment are. This is all highly theoretical for most people. The trouble is it's real. And one day it's going to happen. That's just the nature of it. These rivers are supposed to flood. That's nature of the globe. There's also lots of mythology get in the way. One that I find particularly interesting is the mythology that the Glenbourne Dam, you would have heard of that upstream of Aberdeen on the upper Hunter, that the flood in 55 was either caused or exacerbated, depending on which Ulster you're talking to, by the blowing up of that dam. Well, I did some research into that when I was writing a book on Nathan's flood a few years ago. And I found that the Glenbourne Dam was actually built in 1958. Or sorry, completed in 1958. Makes it hard to see how it was blown up in 55 to create a flood. And yet there are people in Maitland who will tell you that they had an uncle who fired the shot that blew it up. And there's a psychology in that too. I think people want to associate themselves with members of their family with famous events like 55. Yeah, that's a mythology. The dam was not blown up. Quite why you would blow the dam up to prevent a flood is a little bit beyond me too, but let's not deal too much with that. So there is a clear mythology. The date of the building of the dam makes it wrong. I haven't brought it along, but I've got a picture from the Scone Advocate. It happened with the photo is a collage, what they call it when you put together several photos. So a photographer stood at one point and took a bunch of photos and spliced them all together. Not collage, there is a name for it. Panorama. Panorama, yes. And the date on this thing is the 6th of February 55, 3 weeks before the flood. And there's a dotted line across the top, which is where the dam wall will be at completion. And down the bottom is a few measly foundations just been built. So all there was the foundations. And yet a large part of Maitland believes that that the thing was blown up by some heroic person in an attempt to save Maitland. But how it saved it, given what had happened, is a bit hard to tell. There's another mythology which is very resistant, which is basically go away, we've got levies, which misses the point. The levies are built to a certain standard, which is not the standard of the PMF. So a bigger flood than 55 might even be the PMF, but the thing is built to the 55 flood with a freeboard at 0.5 metre, which probably doesn't exist now because it would have second consolidated. So we've got 55 more or less covered, but anything worse than that, we can't guarantee that we have. And anyway, the thing gets damaged, as I say, and you might get flood when it's damaged and you haven't yet managed to fix it. So to say we've got a levy, therefore the flood problem has been solved, is missing the point. It hasn't. It's been ameliorated. It's been mitigated. That's what the word means, mitigated. It's been lessened, but it has not been removed. So there's an awkward set of mythologies and psychologies here, which compounded, I think, by the first point that flood expertise and experience has gone. We've not managed, I don't think, I've made some attempts here, we've not managed to break through. It's very hard to get councils to focus on flood education, educating their communities. They don't want people to be reminded either. And people don't want to be reminded. So people tend to turn off. So we don't really get through with public education to the extent that I would like to hope we would. And I'd say that's a bit of a failure, that we haven't managed to break through, but it has to do with resistance. Not all messages are easy to get through, and it's expensive. I mean, I don't know what we've spent to cut down smoking rates, but it's billions of dollars over the last 50 years, and there are still smokers. There are fewer than there were, which is a good thing. I think now we're down to less than 10%. America's down to about 5%. One of the few things in America leads the world actually is the war on smoking. We're down to less than 10, whereas I think at the end of World War II, 70% of adult men smoked. Fewer women. There's two reasons for that. Women are more sensible, and the notion that women could smoke was not around yet. Part of the equalisation women and men has been smoking. It's one of the downsides of the equalisation process over the last few decades. So smoking rates are down, but it's cost a lot, and we've not solved the problem. What we've actually done through our efforts is create an illegal tobacco industry, as has been in the press lately. Redevelopment. Well, look at again the Maitland case, High Street. High Street has struggled. And the reason is that it's an old style strip centre with difficult parking and bad traffic. And there's a new centre called Stockland Green Hills up on the hills in East Maitland, out of the flood zone, which is all air conditioned, indoors, attractive, and it's become much bigger. It's become a CBD. So the old CBD has suffered. That's a problem because council wants, and it's also lost its small population. So the population of inner Maitland's gone from 5,500 or less than 2,000 over the last 70 years. So it's lost a very rich market. So what does the council want to do? Build up the population. That will give the CBD a market. Yes, it will. That's a good thing. But what you're doing is putting more people in harm's way coming this flood. That's not a good thing. So councils always want to redevelop according to whatever the pressure points are. And the business people of Central Maitland have some power in that regard. Councils generally are told about it. They don't much like being told by the state government you can't allow development in that area because it's floodplain. And I wouldn't want to put my hand on my heart and say that the state government regulations have always been met in Maitland or indeed Newcastle or Hexham or anywhere else. Councils want growth. Now, Maitland's, it's guaranteed. Maitland is, again, this is again something councils don't like to accept. Maitland has become an outer suburb of what you might call lower Hunter City, centred on Newcastle. So Cessnock, Maitland, Raymond Terrace, Port Stephens. People commute to Newcastle, indeed to Sydney every day. And you might even argue that Maitland's part of the greater central coast, by which I mean Wollongong, Sydney, Newcastle, megalopolis. And it's had guaranteed growth because of that. I mean, there was a time when Bert mentioned when Maitland was a big town, much bigger than Newcastle. there are still people in Maitland who will say that Newcastle is an eastern suburb of Maitland. And probably councillors would encourage that sort of thing. It's not true anymore. Maitland is now a dormitory centre. They don't like that message. That implies they're not doing any work. Their people are, of course, they're not all unemployed layabouts. Their people are, but they're just working elsewhere. There is no longer any industry in Maitland as there used to be. People work in the Upper Hunter coal mining industry or in Newcastle. Anyway, councils are keen on growth. Maitland doesn't have to worry about it because it's on the edge of this major metropolitan area. That's where the growth always occurs. But councils are very hard to discourage from growth, and there's lots of pressure internally, the CBD, shopkeepers, for example, to allow population growth. And there was trouble over this. There was a report in 2009. I can't remember the organisation's name. It's commissioned by council. They recommended council seek to boost the population back to 1955 levels from central market, so back to 5,500, which would have meant building on a whole lot of blocks which become vacant, which houses be moved, building some medium rise and high rise, etc., and putting more people on the floodplain. Whereas I would argue that it's a basic rule you should have fewer people on the floodplain, but it's a bit hard to do that when you've got shops, dependents, and people living around. It's the point about development in the past and how it rules the future. No easy way around it. So where have we got to? The question here is, what's the net of it? What's the net of the positives and the negatives? Well, this is where I come back to. Are we ready? Yes and no. It's a bit disappointing. I'm pretty sure that while we've done a lot by way of mitigation, warning system development, getting people off the floodplain, etc., we almost certainly won't do particularly well when there is another bad flood, and that's inevitable at some stage for earlier conversation. Extreme events, by which I mean 55 and worse, are by definition difficult. People don't have experience. People won't be expecting something like 55 or worse. Go back to the Singleton, the old Singleton developments that I saw in 1893 and possibly beyond that. Big events always take people by surprise, whether it's council, the SES, the community at large, and that doesn't make it easy to manage. And one of the problems will be, and I saw this in 2007, not that I was here at the time, but I watched it remotely, trying to get people to evacuate. With the flood then, the Bureau forecasted a certain 11.2 metres at the Belmore Bridge, actually only got to 10.7. What they were saying was that 11.2 metres, lawn is not fully surrounded by levees, so the downstream side might be a bit vulnerable. We're a bit worried about whether the levees are going to be breached or not, so we better get a few people out of them. We need to evacuate. So the SES organised the dawn off, and a number of people told them to go and make love in an alternative location, as one might expect. Again, people don't want to hear that message. I mean, the home is a sanctuary. I'm safe here. I always have been. To be told suddenly you're not and you need to go, and there's various things will happen. As soon as you start to tell people they've got to go, there'll be questions about looters. I'm leaving my house, I'll get looted. So no, I won't. So you can see the resistance and the difficulty there is in organising an evacuation, particularly an evacuation of size, which is what we're talking about. These things are always hard. Never done well, it seems to me. And as I say, whoever's in charge of the SES will almost certainly lose his or her job. With one of mine was Deputy Director General for 7 years, and I never got to, and this is New South Wales, I was never under risk, but I was always aware that there was a potential that I would be found guilty. Well, almost certainly I'd do some things that hindsight would say were wrong, because you're dealing with uncertainty, therefore guesswork, mistakes are going to be made. Other people will make mistakes too, like orders will be disobeyed. I noticed with the latest Optus thing, the CEO immediately said the problem was people did not follow orders. In other words, he was keeping the blame home to staff. Now, we'll find out from Kerry Schott's report whether that's true or not. I can see his party position. He's protecting himself, he's blaming underlings for not following procedures which have been laid out. He might be right, but I'm not taking the judgment, but I can see how it happens. The next bad flood will be big. There will almost certainly be deaths, maybe not in huge numbers. That's one of the things about floods. They don't kill as many as they used to. Lismore in 22 only lost 4 people. I say only literally because it's not a very large number. In the 19th century, you might lose 10 or 20 quite frequently in floods. That's very rare now. To that extent, we can prove the number of things. The mitigation part of it, better warnings is a part of it. Fewer people living on the floodplain and at risk is a part of it. But the next flood, I think it's way worse, will be very possible. So there'll be heaps of infrastructural damage, heaps of housing damage. If people haven't got out, there'll be grave risk, and some of them will probably die. So, my point about this is if you live in a flood-prone area, and most people don't know whether they are, and most people aren't, and some of those who are only going to be prone in a very big flood, which they probably won't see, but it's a good idea not to be there when there is a really bad flood. They are dangerous and people die in them. Over the long term, floods have killed more people in New South Wales than any of the other natural hazards, including bushfires. That's not true for the last 50 years. But over the 200 years of European settlement, it's very true. It says we've solved the flood problem in terms of deaths to a greater extent than we've solved the bushfire problem in terms of deaths. And that's partly because people increasingly lived in tree change environments. And eucalypt, we know what eucalypts do in bushfire, they burn. And people who live outside of cities in these tree change environments are at risk. So the flood problem used to be the worst in terms of deaths. Now it's bushfires in terms of New South Wales and Australia. Nevertheless, there's a lesson there. If you live in a low-lying area near watercourses, and by that I mean in central Newcastle, if you live in Hamilton area, Potter's Creek, that's all floodplain. Not particularly disastrous, almost all the time. A really big flood would be more disastrous than people realise, and they shouldn't be there. Now, whether or not they'll get out is another, when they're told to, is another matter. The SES doesn't stick a pistol in the ribs and order you out. It gives you very firm advice, sometimes with a bit of sarcasm, like, would you give us your funeral details so that we can run that sort of thing. But the point is, there's a limit to the amount of control you've got over what people can do. We're not the Trumpism of the world notwithstanding. We're not yet quite authoritarian enough to be ordering people around willy-nilly. But I would say it's a good idea not to be on a floodplain when there's a flood. But I think I've taken my time, so I'll get out of the way. But I'm quite happy to answer your questions, even though I probably won't be able to.
Well, I've got just a couple of comments. As somebody who has and continues to spend a lot of time west of Hexham, I was always bitterly disappointed when the flood signs disappeared from Hexham. They were a tourist attraction to me. As a kid, they were always pointed out. But
they're spectacular, aren't they? When you see how high up they
but one of the things I will always remember is how high up the flood was on the single signal box at Maitland Station. Every time we came through on the train, my mother would point it out, and for a long time you could see the line.
Well, there are 3 markers on the wall of Maitland Station: 49, 1893, 55 is there, 1893 is there, and 49 is there. They are frozen. And that's on the main station wall, and they're all way above the platform, so vastly above the line. So there won't be trains going through the water.
And the other comment I was going to say about Glenville Dam, I'm wondering whether when the next big flood happens, whether people will blame by the fact that they raised the wall of the Glenville Dam.
Which they didn't raise them. Didn't hold enough water. I mean, look, there's lots of cases of this. Brisbane, for example. There was a bad flood in 1890, after which they built it was called the Somerset Dam. And people thought, well, thank God for that, they'll fix the problem. Then 1974 came along and they built 5 And in 2011, Ivanhoe became a problem in terms of releases from water. They delayed too long, and then they had to let a lot go in a hurry because they feared for the security of the dam. That's one thing we have PMS for, we call massive floods, so that you can build your dam to withhold the standard PMF. I mean, you think what would happen if Roy again the dam
Oh,
failed in a big flood? Well, apart from there goes Windsor, Penrith, etc., 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 the death line. You don't have a water supply. 5 million people for some years. Now, we've now got desalination, so there's a way around that. But that was a serious problem. And they discovered in about 1990 that it might survive as like a 1,500-year flood, as in a flood which would happen on the side of 1,500 years on average. The PMF might be 100,000, a million, even bigger. Dams are an issue. And one of the reasons we have PMFs is to be able to give a bit of a sense of how big the dam's got to be built. It's got to hold the PMF and not do what they want. So what they did with the dam space when they found it was only handle 1,500 years. Way bigger than 1867, but smaller than the PMF was that they built it up higher and second, which is a lot of expense, obviously. Anyway, someone else had a question.
Oh, I was just commenting because of my own personal experience all my life living on the Lachlan. And
Living on the what? The Lachlan?
the Lachlan Falls. And the other thing that happened, our original family started out in Northern, and one of their children, a 4-year-old Mary, she was washed down the river and went down in one of the Northern floods in the 1800s. But then the family got out west, and my dad was the first country correspondent appointed by the APC in the Central West. So in the 1955 floods, I was 12 and I was part of the warning there. I mean, I was only 12, but my dad had the ABC in Orange was the only way of getting the message out to farmers, the level of the river.
Yep.
You know, it was very hard, we didn't have computers or anything or mobile phones or anything else. So my brother and I was 12 at the time, I think younger, very bright, and I think the university knows it. So he was handy. And we had to stay up through the night in the 55 floods on the Lachlan. And during my dad's break, I had a couple of changes, you know, because we had to farm the bill down the river from, you know, further up towards the coast and come down. And someone had to take each corner, and then my dad would have been Orange and say, it's Winston, same with and then they put it over the radio all night. So the farmers heard that.
And they would make their own calculation of what it meant to be.
And like I at 12 and 55, had that that's part of what we were doing, you know, because there wasn't enough like the warning system, it wasn't like now with the communication systems. And we were part of it.
Yeah.
I felt very responsible.
Yeah.
I thought those farmers won't get that sheep out.
Yes, if you've got it wrong, you won't be responsible for killing people.
And I was,
The Lachlan's interesting. I mean, Forbes itself gets cut into 3 in floods. 52 was really bad on those.
Yes.
Forbes has been others since. 90 was bad. Lots of evacuations. I mean, these places ideally shouldn't be there. The trouble
we
is
were
they
lucky
are.
we lived on the hill.
Yes.
And we always had family from my dad's newspaper who stayed with us when the hits came.
Yep.
My mum would say, quick, get the clean sheets out. And, you know,
You gave them clean sheets.
Yeah.
Very generous.
Well, responsibility.
Yes.
And we had a big sleep out where we could put all the children up.
Yes.
But it was sort of, you went into action mode.
Yes. Yes.
And I was allowed to load bread onto the planes. So that where they dropped them in the park. So that
Yep.
all the children would go
That's a big thing, actually. There used to be things called water brigades. I don't know about on the Lachlan, but on the coastal rivers, the Hawkesbury, the Hunter, the Richmond, and particularly the Clarence, there were volunteer organisations called water brigades that used to row around dropping off bread and milk and medicines and the like. And so long as they could, and so long as they had phone, people would phone in and all the things. And that led to all sorts of interesting stories. One bloke objected because he got the bread came from the wrong bakery. Who cares? He cared. So here he's getting a service for free, and it's the wrong bakery.
We were actually taken through the flood river out to the Geraldine Road on an army tank. We thought, well, really, top notch because we were sitting on the site, and then they took this whole bunch of sort of, 12 to 13 year olds up through the water and then up on Jericho Road. And that's where the plane can land, because
Yep.
people were driving, right? And we had to have a convoy and, loading.
Yep.
And the farmers all had to put sheds on their roof with SOS, if they needed to. And like, it was quite exciting.
Army ducks were a big part of the late 40s and 50s floods. Not anymore. And lots of hilarious things happened. Like at Moree, I know there were two in 1955, or you must have been. And they spent the entire flood pulling each other out of the mud. They weren't able to do very much, but they were imperfect. We've got better equipment now, UNMOs like, but they did a job. And they're part of the folklore making, actually, as are the helicopters, which also had their problems, and being involved in accidents that kill people. But it's an interesting story, all of this. And everywhere that's had floods has lots of stories of this.
Well, thank you so much for that. That really has been a wonderful presentation, and I know everybody has enjoyed it. Tell that
Well,
by the questions.
and they didn't go to sleep.
And they did.